Throw him out, Ethan Whitmore said, his voice cutting clean through the polished air like it belonged there more than anyone else. The lobby went still. Conversations died mid-sentence, heels paused on marble, the soft hum of the revolving door faded into something quieter, tighter, like the building itself was holding its breath. At the center of it all stood Elijah Brooks. He didn't look like he belonged. His coat was worn at the edges, the fabric softened by years of weather and waiting. His shoes carried the dull dust of sidewalks that never quite felt like home. And yet he stood straight, not defiant, not apologetic, just present in a way that made people uncomfortable without knowing why. 2 security guards approached, their steps measured, professional, but their eyes already decided. One gestured toward the door with a polite firmness that barely masked dismissal. "Sir, you'll need to leave." Elijah didn't move right away. His gaze drifted slowly across the lobby, not scanning, not searching, but remembering. The high ceilings stretched above him like a cathedral of glass and steel, sunlight spilling through in clean lines that reflected off the floor beneath his feet. The scent of polished wood and expensive cologne hung faintly in the air. It was a place designed to impress, to separate, to remind people exactly where they stood. Ethan adjusted his cufflinks, irritation flickering across his face as the moment stretched longer than it should have. He was used to efficiency, to control, to problems being removed the second they appeared. And right now, Elijah Brooks was a problem. "I said remove him," Ethan added, quieter this time, but sharper. The guard stepped closer. One reached out, not rough, not aggressive, just enough to guide. Elijah finally shifted, not resisting, not complying, just turning his head slightly as if listening to something no one else could hear. For a brief second, his eyes met Ethan's. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't fear. It was something else entirely, something calm, something grounded, something that didn't fit the role Ethan had already assigned him. Then Elijah spoke, his voice low, steady, carrying further than it should have in a room like this. "You might want to take a closer look before you decide who doesn't belong." A faint ripple moved through the crowd. Someone near the reception desk let out a quiet chuckle, quickly stifled. Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line. He had heard variations of this before. Excuses? Deflections. People trying to hold on to dignity in places that had no intention of giving it. "This isn't a shelter," Ethan replied, his tone controlled, almost rehearsed. "This is a private building." Elijah's gaze lifted again, this time toward the upper floors, where sunlight caught along the edges of glass balconies and steel beams. His expression didn't change, but something in the stillness around him deepened, like a memory pressing gently against the present. The guards guided him toward the entrance. The revolving door spun slowly as it opened, letting in a thin thread of outside air, cooler, less filtered, carrying the distant sounds of the street beyond. Just before stepping through, Elijah paused. Not long enough to cause a scene. Just long enough to leave something behind. "Sometimes," he said quietly, almost to himself, "ownership doesn't look the way people expect." The door turned. The lobby swallowed the silence he left behind. And for a moment, even Ethan Whitmore, standing in the center of everything he believed he controlled, felt the faintest shift, like something unseen had just been set in motion. The glass doors rotated shut behind Elijah Brooks with a soft mechanical sigh, and the city greeted him the way it always did, indifferent and moving, a steady stream of taxis, footsteps, and distant sirens blending into a rhythm that never waited for anyone. He stepped onto the sidewalk without looking back, the cool air brushing against his face, carrying the faint scent of rain that had not yet arrived. For a moment he stood still, hands resting loosely at his sides, as if letting the noise of the street settle into him, as if reminding himself that he had always known how to exist in places that refused to see him. Across the street, a delivery truck idled, its engine humming low, while a group of office workers passed by in pressed shirts and quiet conversations, none of them sparing him more than a glance. To them, he was already invisible again. But Elijah did not shrink into that invisibility. He lifted his chin slightly, his eyes drifting upward to the building behind him, its mirrored surface reflecting the sky in long, clean stretches of light. There was no bitterness in his expression, no anger tightening his jaw, only a quiet recognition. Like someone revisiting a place that had once been part of his life in a way no one else could understand. A gust of wind tugged lightly at the edge of his coat, and he reached into the inside pocket with a slow, deliberate motion, pulling out a small, worn leather wallet. It was not the kind that drew attention, no polished finish, no brand name stamped across it, just something old and carefully kept. He opened it briefly, glancing down at its contents, not to check, not to confirm, but to remember. Then he closed it again and slipped it back into place. The traffic light shifted, and the flow of people crossed the street, their footsteps tapping against the pavement in uneven sync. Elijah stepped forward with them, blending into the movement without effort, his pace steady, unhurried, like he had nowhere urgent to be and yet knew exactly where he was going. Behind him, the building stood tall and unchanged, its doors opening and closing as if nothing had happened at all. Inside, the lobby resumed its rhythm. Conversations picked up, heels clicked against marble, the reception desk phone rang once, then again, and was answered with practiced calm. Ethan Whitmore remained where he was, near the center of the space, though his posture had shifted ever so slightly, the sharp edge of his earlier command dulled by something he could not quite name. He adjusted his jacket again, a habit more than a need, and turned toward the front desk. "Make sure security logs that incident," he said, his tone returning to its usual control, though a faint hesitation lingered beneath it. The receptionist nodded quickly, fingers already moving across the keyboard. "Yes, sir." Ethan glanced once toward the doors, where the sunlight still spilled in through the glass, and for a fraction of a second, the image of Elijah standing there lingered in his mind, not as a disruption, but as something unresolved. He exhaled quietly, dismissing it, and turned away, stepping toward the elevators as they opened with a soft chime. The doors slid apart, revealing a mirrored interior that reflected him back at himself, composed, confident, exactly as he expected to be seen. He stepped inside, pressing the button for the upper floors, and as the doors began to close, the reflection held steady, unchanged, unaware that somewhere beyond the glass and steel, a different version of the same story was already beginning to unfold. The elevator doors closed with a quiet precision, sealing Ethan Whitmore inside a space that felt controlled, predictable, entirely his. The soft hum of ascent filled the silence as the numbers above the panel began to climb, one floor at a time, each one marking distance from the lobby below, from the interruption he had already decided was behind him. He stood straight, shoulders squared, eyes fixed forward, but his reflection in the mirrored walls told a quieter story, one where something small had shifted just enough to be noticed, if only by him. On the 27th floor, the doors opened into a corridor lined with dark wood panels and soft lighting, the kind designed to suggest importance without needing to announce it. Ethan stepped out, his shoes moving across the carpet with a muted confidence, and made his way toward the conference room where a group of investors had already gathered. The low murmur of voices filtered through the glass before he even reached the door, a mix of anticipation and expectation that always came with numbers large enough to change lives, or end them. Inside, the table stretched long and immaculate, documents arranged in careful stacks, water glasses catching the light in small, controlled reflections. A man in a navy suit looked up as Ethan entered. "We were just about to begin," he said, offering a polite nod. Ethan returned it, taking his seat at the head of the table, the position he had earned through years of precision, discipline, and an unshakable belief that details separated success from failure. "Let us proceed," Ethan replied, his voice steady, professional, exactly as expected. A folder was slid toward him, its cover marked with clean lettering, the final draft of a lease restructuring that would bring in a new wave of high-profile tenants. He opened it, scanning the pages with practiced speed, numbers, clauses, conditions, each line falling into place like pieces of a system he understood completely. Across the table, someone began outlining the terms, their voice smooth, confident, rehearsed. But as Ethan's eyes moved down the page, something slowed. Not a mistake. Not exactly. Just a phrase buried deep within the language, subtle enough to be overlooked, but carrying a weight that did not sit right. He paused, his finger resting lightly against the margin. "This clause," he said, interrupting the flow just enough to shift attention. "It reallocates liability in a way that seems unnecessary." The room quieted slightly, heads turning, not in shock, but in interest. The man in the navy suit leaned forward. "It is standard language," he replied. Ethan did not respond immediately. His gaze lingered on the text, the words arranged in a way that felt familiar, though he could not place why. For a brief moment, the image of Elijah Brooks standing in the lobby flickered through his mind, not as a distraction, but as an echo, a line that had not finished speaking. "You might want to take a closer look." Ethan exhaled softly, closing the folder halfway, not rejecting it, but not accepting it either. "We will review this section again," he said, his tone leaving little room for argument. Around the table, there were nods, subtle, measured, the kind that acknowledged authority without challenging it. The meeting continued, but something had shifted beneath the surface, a thin thread of uncertainty woven into the otherwise flawless structure of the deal. Outside the conference room, the city stretched wide beneath the glass, sunlight reflecting off buildings that looked identical from a distance, each one holding stories no one could see from above. And somewhere down on the street, moving through that same city without urgency, without recognition, Elijah Brooks walked with a quiet certainty that did not need permission, his presence no longer in the room, but not entirely gone either, as if the space itself had remembered him in a way no one else yet had. The meeting resumed, but the rhythm had changed, subtle at first, like a metronome slipping half a beat off time. Ethan Whitmore sat forward slightly, the folder open again in front of him, his eyes tracing the same paragraph with more intention now, slower, more deliberate. The language was precise, polished, designed to blend into the structure of the agreement without drawing attention, but the deeper he looked, the more it revealed itself as something else entirely, something that shifted responsibility in a way that could not be easily undone once signed. Around him, voices continued, steady, confident, explaining projections, timelines, projected returns measured in percentages and years, but Ethan was no longer fully listening. His focus had narrowed to the page, to the quiet realization forming beneath the surface. "Pause for a moment," he said, not raising his voice, but commanding enough to bring the room to stillness again. A few of the investors exchanged glances, uncertain, but no one interrupted. Ethan tapped the document lightly. "This section here reallocates long-term structural liability to the building management under conditions that are too broadly defined. If any external compliance issue arises, the responsibility shifts entirely to us." The man in the navy suit straightened, his expression tightening just slightly. "It is within acceptable parameters," he replied, though his tone carried less certainty than before. Ethan leaned back, his fingers steepled, his gaze lifting from the document to the people around the table. "Acceptable for whom?" he asked quietly. The question lingered, heavier than expected. No one answered immediately. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but revealing, like a curtain pulled back just enough to expose something unfinished behind it. Ethan closed the folder this time, fully, the soft thud echoing faintly in the controlled space. "We are not proceeding with this version," he said, each word measured final. A ripple moved through the room, subtle but undeniable. One of the junior analysts shifted in his seat, glancing down at his tablet as if searching for something to ground himself in. Another cleared his throat but said nothing. The man in the navy suit exhaled slowly, then nodded once. "We can revise the language," he said. Ethan did not respond right away. His gaze drifted briefly toward the glass wall of the conference room, where the city stretched beyond, vast and distant, each building reflecting another, layers of ownership and identity overlapping in ways that were not always visible from the outside. And again, without invitation, the image returned. Elijah Brooks, standing still in the center of the lobby, not resisting, not explaining, just present in a way that refused to fit the assumptions placed on him. "You might want to take a closer look." The words settled differently now, no longer a passing remark, but a quiet instruction that had already begun to reshape something Ethan thought he understood. He turned back to the table. "Before we move forward," he added, his tone calmer now, more grounded, "I want a full audit of the current ownership structure and all associated liabilities tied to this building. Not summaries. Not excerpts. Everything." The room absorbed the request, the weight of it clear. "That will take some time," someone said carefully. "Then take the time," Ethan replied. No irritation. No impatience. Just certainty. The meeting began to dissolve after that, not abruptly, but gradually, conversations lowering, documents being gathered, chairs sliding back with soft, controlled movements. As people filed out, the man in the navy suit lingered for a moment. "You are being cautious," he said, almost as an observation. Ethan met his gaze. "I am being thorough," he answered. When the room finally emptied, Ethan remained seated, the quiet settling around him like a second layer of space. He reached for the folder again, opening it one last time, his eyes returning to the clause that had nearly gone unnoticed. For a brief second, his reflection in the glass caught his attention, not the composed manager others saw, but someone standing at the edge of a realization that had not fully formed yet. Somewhere below, far from the controlled environment of the conference room, the street continued its steady motion. And within that motion, Elijah Brooks moved forward without hesitation, as if he had already seen how this would unfold, as if the outcome had never been in question, only the moment when others would finally understand it. The conference room door clicked shut behind the last departing executive, and the silence that followed felt heavier than before, no longer neutral, but filled with something unresolved. Ethan Whitmore remained seated, the closed folder resting beneath his hand, his fingers tapping once, then stilling, as if even that small motion felt unnecessary now. The light from the floor to ceiling windows had shifted, softer, angled differently, casting longer reflections across the polished table. Time had moved, even if the room had not. He stood slowly, adjusting his jacket out of habit, but the movement lacked its usual precision. There was a hesitation now, subtle but present, like a thought that refused to settle. He gathered the documents and stepped out into the hallway, the quiet hum of the building returning around him, distant conversations, the faint chime of elevators, the steady rhythm of a place designed to operate without interruption. But something had already interrupted it. At the far end of the corridor, his assistant approached, tablet in hand, her expression composed but edged with curiosity. "You asked for a full ownership audit," she said. "I pulled preliminary records." Ethan nodded once. "Send them to my office." He continued walking, his pace measured, but not rushed, as if each step carried more weight than before. Inside his office, the space was immaculate, everything in its place, glass desk cleared, skyline stretching wide beyond the windows. It was the kind of environment that reinforced control, clarity, order. He set the folder down and turned toward the screen as it lit up with incoming files. Names, entities, layered structures of ownership unfolded in neat columns, each one tied to another, a network designed to be understood by those who knew where to look. Ethan scrolled, his eyes moving quickly at first, then slower as the complexity deepened. A holding company. A secondary trust. Another entity layered beneath it, each one connected, each one leading further away from a simple answer. His jaw tightened slightly, not in frustration, but in concentration. Who structured this? He murmured, almost to himself. The system was not random. It was deliberate, built with precision, designed to conceal without hiding, to exist in plain sight while remaining just out of reach. He leaned closer, scanning the names again, and then he saw it. Not at the top. Not in bold. But there, embedded within the structure, listed under a parent entity that controlled the majority stake in the building. Elijah Brooks. The name sat quietly on the screen, unremarkable to anyone who was not looking for it, but impossible to ignore once seen. Ethan blinked once, as if the act might change what he was reading, but it remained, unchanged, steady, undeniable. His hand lifted slightly from the desk, then lowered again, the motion small but revealing. The room felt different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because something internal had shifted beyond reversal. The memory returned with clarity this time, not fragmented, not distant, but exact. Elijah standing in the lobby, calm, unshaken, his voice steady as he spoke words that had been dismissed too quickly. "You might want to take a closer look." Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath measured, controlled, but deeper than before. He straightened, stepping back from the desk, his eyes still fixed on the name as if it might disappear if he looked away. It did not. It remained anchored in the system, in the structure, in the reality he had nearly overlooked. A soft knock came at the door. "Come in," Ethan said. His voice even, though something beneath it had shifted. His assistant stepped inside. "Is everything all right?" she asked carefully. Ethan did not answer immediately. He turned slightly, his gaze moving from the screen to the window, to the city beyond, to the streets far below where people moved without knowing the weight of what had just been uncovered. "Find him," he said finally. No explanation. No elaboration. Just two words, clear, direct, carrying a weight that did not need to be explained. His assistant hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. "Yes, sir." The door closed behind her, and the office returned to silence. Ethan stood there, the reflection of the skyline stretching across the glass, and for the first time since the morning began, the certainty that had always defined him felt incomplete, not gone, but altered, like a structure that still stood, but with a foundation that had just been revealed to be something entirely different than he had believed. And somewhere beyond the glass, beyond the controlled space of the building, Elijah Brooks continued forward, unseen by most, but no longer unknown to the one man who had tried to remove him from a place he had never truly left. The city had shifted into late afternoon, the light no longer sharp but softened into long golden reflections that stretched across glass and pavement alike, and somewhere between those reflections Elijah Brooks sat alone on a worn wooden bench at the edge of a small park just 2 blocks from the building, his posture relaxed, his hands resting loosely in his lap as if time had slowed around him, while everything else continued forward. The sounds of the street were still there, distant traffic, footsteps, a faint siren carried by the wind, but here they felt muted, like they belonged to another layer of the city he had stepped slightly outside of. A paper coffee cup sat beside him, half empty, its warmth long gone, but he did not reach for it. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on the skyline beyond the trees, where the building stood among many others, indistinguishable to most, but not to him. There was no bitterness in his expression, no trace of anger from what had happened earlier, only a quiet stillness that suggested something deeper than reaction, something rooted in understanding rather than resistance. A breeze moved through the leaves above, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across his face, and for a moment, he closed his eyes, not in exhaustion, but in reflection, as if listening to something internal that did not need words. Inside the building, far above the street, Ethan Whitmore stood near the window of his office, his reflection layered over the city beyond, his phone resting silent in his hand. The request he had made had already been set in motion, teams pulling records, cross-checking details, confirming what he had already seen for himself, but the confirmation had not brought clarity, only a deeper awareness of how close he had come to dismissing something that mattered. He exhaled slowly, turning away from the glass, the controlled environment of his office now feeling less certain, less complete than it had that morning. His gaze moved briefly to the screen again, to the name that remained unchanged, Elijah Brooks, steady and undeniable, not just a presence, but a foundation. Down below, Elijah opened his eyes again, his attention shifting to a small child nearby who had dropped a ball that rolled unevenly across the grass before stopping near his feet. Without hesitation, Elijah leaned forward, picked it up, and held it out as the child approached, her steps cautious at first, then quicker as she recognized the simple kindness of the gesture. "Thank you," she said softly, taking the ball with both hands. Elijah nodded once, a small, warm acknowledgement, nothing more, nothing needed. The child ran back, her laughter blending into the background of the park, light and unburdened. Elijah watched for a moment, then leaned back again, his gaze returning to the skyline, to the building that reflected the fading sun. There was no urgency in him, no need to act, to confront, or to prove. The truth existed whether it was acknowledged or not. That had always been enough. Back upstairs, a notification lit up on Ethan's phone, a message from his assistant. "We located him. Nearby park, 2 blocks east." Ethan read the words once, then again, as if allowing them to settle fully before he responded. His hand tightened slightly around the phone, not from anger, but from something closer to responsibility. The moment he had moved past earlier was no longer behind him. It was waiting. He reached for his jacket, the fabric smooth beneath his fingers. Familiar, controlled, and yet it no longer carried the same certainty it had before. As he stepped toward the door, the office remained exactly as he left it, clean lines, perfect order. But something within that order had shifted, something that could not be unseen. Outside, the elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Ethan stepped inside, the descent beginning, each floor passing in quiet succession, bringing him closer not just to the ground level, but to a moment he could no longer ignore. In the park, Elijah remained where he was, the light around him fading into evening, the air cooling, the city continuing its endless motion, unaware that 2 paths were about to cross again, not by accident, but by something far more deliberate, something that had been set in motion long before either of them fully understood it. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Ethan Whitmore stepped out into the evening air, the controlled silence of the building replaced instantly by the living pulse of the city, car horns in the distance, footsteps crossing pavement, voices blending into a rhythm that did not pause for realization or regret. He adjusted his pace as he moved east, each step deliberate but no longer driven by routine, instead guided by something quieter, heavier, a need to close a moment that had been left unfinished. The golden light of late afternoon had begun to fade into something cooler, shadows stretching longer across the sidewalks, the edges of buildings softening as the day gave way to evening. 2 blocks felt longer than they should have. Not because of distance, but because of what waited at the end of it. The park came into view gradually, first the line of trees, then the open grass, then the scattered benches where people sat in quiet conversations or solitary thought. Ethan slowed as he entered, his eyes scanning the space until they found him. Elijah Brooks sat exactly where the message had said he would be, unmoving, grounded, as if the world had passed through him all day without altering anything essential. For a moment, Ethan did not approach. He stood a few feet away, the space between them filled with everything that had happened and everything that had not yet been said. Elijah sensed him before he spoke. His head turned slightly, his gaze lifting with the same calm awareness he had carried in the lobby, in the street, in every moment since. There was no surprise in his expression. Only recognition. Ethan stepped closer, the sound of his shoes against the path soft but clear. "Mr. Brooks," he began, his voice steady, though not as certain as it had been hours before. Elijah regarded him quietly, then gave a small nod, not formal, not distant, just acknowledging presence. "You found what you were looking for," Elijah said, not as a question, but as a simple truth. Ethan paused, the words settling before he answered. "Yes," he said, and the single syllable carried more weight than any explanation could have. The air between them shifted, not tense, not confrontational, but honest in a way that removed the need for performance. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping for a brief moment before returning. "I did not know," he added, the admission quiet, but deliberate. Elijah leaned back slightly against the bench, his hands resting where they had been before, his posture unchanged. "No," he replied, his tone even. "You did not." There was no accusation in it. No bitterness. Just a statement of fact. Ethan felt it more deeply because of that. The absence of anger left no place to deflect, no space to defend. Only the truth remained. He looked out toward the skyline for a moment, the building visible beyond the trees, its glass reflecting the last light of the day. "That building," Ethan said slowly, "it belongs to you." Elijah followed his gaze, his eyes resting on the structure without hesitation. It has for a long time, he answered. The simplicity of it settled heavily. Ethan let the silence stretch, not out of uncertainty, but because it felt necessary, like something that could not be rushed. Why did you not say it clearly? He asked after a moment, turning back. Back there. Elijah's expression softened just slightly, not into a smile, but into something closer to understanding. Would it have changed how you saw me? He asked. The question landed without force, but it did not need any. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. The answer formed, honest and uncomfortable. Yes, he said finally. Elijah nodded once, as if that had been expected. That is the point, he replied. The words settled into the space between them, not loud, not dramatic, but complete. Ethan stood there, the weight of the realization moving through him, not as a sudden shock, but as something deeper, something that reshaped more than just a moment. The city continued around them, unchanged, but for Ethan Whitmore, the structure he thought he understood had shifted entirely, and for the first time, he saw it not from the top down, but from the ground up, exactly where Elijah Brooks had been standing all along. The silence between them did not break immediately, and that was what made it different, not fragile, not tense, but steady, like something that had finally found its true shape. Ethan Whitmore remained standing for a moment longer, then slowly lowered himself onto the opposite end of the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition. The evening air had cooled further, carrying with it the faint scent of the city settling into night, streetlights beginning to flicker on one by one beyond the park's edge. Elijah Brooks did not move when Ethan sat, his gaze still resting on the skyline, but there was an awareness now, shared, unspoken, that the conversation had shifted into something more meaningful than explanation. Ethan rested his hands lightly on his knees, his posture no longer rigid, no longer shaped by authority, but by something quieter, something more grounded. I handled that moment wrong, he said after a while, his voice calm, without defensiveness, without excuse. The words did not rush out. They arrived with intention. Elijah's eyes remained forward, but a slight change in his expression suggested he had heard every part of it. You handled it the way you were used to handling things, he replied, his tone even, not dismissing, not softening, simply placing the truth where it belonged. Ethan nodded once, absorbing that, not resisting it. That is exactly the problem, he said quietly. The admission settled between them, not heavy, but real. For a moment neither spoke. The sounds of the park filled the space instead, leaves shifting in the breeze, distant laughter, the steady rhythm of footsteps passing along the path. Life continued around them, unaware of the shift that had just taken place. Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze following Elijah's toward the building rising in the distance. You built something remarkable, he said, not as flattery, but as acknowledgement. Elijah exhaled softly, the breath barely visible in the cooling air. I built something that was meant to outlast me, he replied. Something that would stand regardless of who was seen or unseen within it. Ethan turned his head slightly, studying him now, not as an outsider, not as a problem to be removed, but as someone whose presence carried weight far beyond appearance. And yet you stood outside it today, Ethan said. Elijah allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to touch his expression, not bitter, not amused, but reflective. Ownership does not guarantee recognition, he said. It never has. The simplicity of it landed deeper than anything else had. Ethan looked down briefly, his hands clasping together for a moment before relaxing again. It should not be that way, he said, more to himself than to Elijah. Elijah turned his head slightly now, meeting Ethan's gaze directly. Then change it, he replied. There was no challenge in the words, no demand, only an opening, a possibility placed clearly in front of him. Ethan held that gaze, understanding the weight behind such a simple statement. Change was not a policy. It was a choice. One that required more than acknowledgement. One that required action. He nodded slowly, the motion deliberate, grounded in something that had not been present before. "I will," he said. Not as a promise made lightly, but as a commitment forming in real time. Elijah studied him for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, as if accepting the sincerity of what had been said without needing to question it. The city lights had grown brighter now, the building in the distance reflecting them in long, steady lines, a structure that looked unchanged from the outside, even as something within it had already begun to shift. Elijah pushed himself up from the bench, the movement unhurried, natural. Ethan stood as well, not out of obligation, but out of respect. For a brief moment, they stood facing each other, no longer separated by assumption or role, but connected by something simpler, clearer. Elijah extended his hand, not formal, not performative, just real. Ethan took it, his grip firm, steady, the gesture carrying more meaning than any apology alone could have. When they released, Elijah stepped back slightly, his gaze returning once more to the skyline before he turned toward the path leading out of the park. Ethan remained where he was, watching him go, not with uncertainty, but with a clarity that had taken shape only after everything he thought he knew had been quietly undone and rebuilt in a way he could no longer ignore. The path out of the park stretched quietly beneath the glow of streetlights. Each step Elijah Brooks took measured and unhurried, as if he carried no need to rush toward anything or away from what had already passed. The city had settled into night, the earlier noise softened into a steady hum, headlights gliding along the streets like distant currents, windows lit in scattered patterns across the skyline. Behind him, Ethan Whitmore remained still for a moment longer, the space where Elijah had stood now empty, yet somehow more defined than before, as if presence had left an imprint that silence could not erase. Then, without hesitation, Ethan turned and began walking back toward the building, his pace different now, not driven by routine, but by intention. The glass doors parted as he approached, the lobby inside glowing with the same polished calm it had held that morning, but it no longer felt the same. The marble floors reflected his steps in clean lines, the reception desk stood exactly as it had, the security guards in place, the quiet order unchanged on the surface. Yet something beneath that order had shifted, something invisible but undeniable. Ethan paused just inside the entrance, his gaze moving across the space, seeing it not as a system to manage, but as an environment shaped by every choice made within it. The memory of Elijah standing there returned with clarity, not as a disruption, but as a moment that had revealed more than it had concealed. He stepped forward, approaching the front desk, where the receptionist looked up, her expression attentive, expecting the usual instructions, the usual precision. Ethan rested his hand lightly on the counter, his voice calm, but carrying a new weight. "Effective immediately," he said. "No one is to be turned away based on appearance alone. If there is a question, it is brought to me. No assumptions." The words settled into the space, simple, direct, leaving no room for interpretation. The receptionist nodded quickly, but there was a pause, a recognition that this was not routine, that something fundamental had just been altered. Ethan continued without raising his voice. "And update the intake protocols. Everyone who walks through those doors is treated with the same baseline respect. No exceptions." The security guards exchanged brief glances, subtle, but noticeable, as if recalibrating something they had never been asked to question before. Ethan did not elaborate further. He did not need to. The clarity was enough. He turned away from the desk and walked across the lobby, his reflection moving with him along the polished floor, no longer just the image of authority, but something more grounded, more aware. As he reached the elevators, he paused briefly, glancing once more toward the glass doors, where the city beyond continued its endless motion, unaware of the shift that had taken place inside. Somewhere out there, Elijah Brooks walked through the same night, unseen by most, unchanged in the way that mattered, carrying a quiet certainty that did not depend on recognition. The elevator doors opened, and Ethan stepped inside, the mirrored walls reflecting him from every angle, not as he had been that morning, but as someone who had finally seen the difference between control and understanding. The doors slid closed, sealing the space in soft silence, and as the elevator began its ascent, The building itself seemed unchanged to anyone looking from the outside, just another structure of glass and steel against the darkened sky. But inside, something had shifted, not in the walls, not in the lights, but in the way it would be seen, in the way it would be lived in the quiet, unseen choices that shape what a place truly becomes. And in that stillness, in that quiet movement of air and light and reflection, there was no need for words, because the truth had already settled into place, and it did not need to speak to be heard.